Nobody in Lord of the Rings was born a monster. Every character on this list started somewhere good, somewhere noble. But something broke them. A ring. A whisper. A promise of power they couldn't refuse. Corruption in Middle-earth isn't about being evil. It's about falling. And today we're ranking the most corrupted characters in the entire franchise, starting with the one who fell the shortest distance. Boromir. Boromir is the lightest entry on this list, and that's exactly why he goes first. His corruption lasted days. Not decades, not centuries. Days. And he snapped out of it before he even died. But here's the thing, that brief window of madness is one of the most heartbreaking moments in the entire trilogy because the ring didn't turn Boromir into something he wasn't. It found what was already there and twisted it. This was the firstborn son of the Steward of Gondor, raised in a city slowly losing a war for generations. A warrior beloved by his people, carrying a bone-deep belief that strength wins wars. That if you just had enough power, you could save everyone. The ring heard that and said, "Perfect, it didn't whisper destruction, it whispered salvation. Use me, and Gondor survives. Use me, and your people live." He wasn't reaching for the ring out of greed. He was reaching for it out of desperate love for a kingdom he watched crumble his entire life. But the moment he cornered Frodo on Amon Hen, something snapped. And the proof is what happened after Frodo vanished. The madness lifted immediately. Boromir sat down, put his face in his hands, and realized what he'd done. His final stand tells you everything. He threw himself between Merry and Pippin and an entire squad of Uruk-hai, taking arrow after arrow until he couldn't stand. And his last words? He didn't curse the ring. He asked Aragorn to save his people. The same man he always was, briefly hijacked by something older and darker than he could resist. If Boromir's corruption is a 1 on the scale, a good man who broke for a moment and clawed his way back, then what does a 10 look like? The next entry gives us a taste because Theoden didn't just lose himself for a few days. He lost years. Theoden. Theoden ruled Rohan for nearly 40 years, and for most of that time, he was everything a king should be. Strong, respected, capable. So when you first meet him in the story, slumped on his throne like a man 3 decades older than he actually is, something clearly went wrong. And it wasn't old age. Here's where it gets unsettling. Theoden's decline started roughly 4 to 5 years before the War of the Ring, and it wasn't because his body was failing him. It was because someone he trusted was slowly taking him apart. Grima Wormtongue, his chief advisor, was likely administering slow poisons disguised as medicine, all while Saruman's magical influence worked through Grima like a signal through an antenna. The guy was being chemically and psychologically dismantled by the one person he relied on most, but the poison was only half of it. Grima controlled everything Theoden heard. Orc raids devastating the Westfold, downplayed, advisors pushing back against Grima's influence, isolated and removed. Theoden wasn't just weakened, he was cut off from reality entirely, trapped inside a version of the world that Grima built around him. Now the films show this as full-on magical possession, Saruman literally speaking through Theoden's mouth. The books describe something way more insidious. A capable king, fully aware on some level, but too weakened and manipulated to act on what he knew. That's not possession. That's psychological warfare. And here's the part that proves the corruption never reached his core. The moment Gandalf broke through and freed him, Theoden snapped back almost immediately. Not partially, not slowly. He went from a broken shell to leading the charge at Pelennor Fields, one of the most legendary moments in the entire story. That kind of recovery doesn't happen if the rot goes deep. He ranks above Boromir because this wasn't a matter of days. This lasted years, and Theoden couldn't have broken free on his own. He needed Gandalf to pull him out. Boromir fell for something shiny and fought his way back alone. Theoden fell for slow poison dressed as medicine from a man he called friend, and that's a different kind of terrifying. But if Theoden was the victim, then the man holding the syringe deserves a closer look. Grima Wormtongue. Tolkien literally named this man what he was. Grima comes from Old English words meaning mask or specter. He didn't even try to hide it. The guy's name is basically creepy liar, and nobody in Adoras thought to question that. But here's the thing, Grima wasn't born a villain. He was born a politician in a culture that only respected swords. His gifts were words, persuasion, and cunning, and in Rohan, where your worth was measured by how many orcs you could cut down on horseback, those gifts meant nothing. That kind of resentment, that feeling of being invisible in a world that doesn't value what you bring to the table, made him the perfect target for Saruman. And Saruman knew exactly what to offer him. Grima's role was surgical. He was Saruman's intelligence asset inside Edoras, feeding information outward and feeding poison inward. Every report from the Westfold got twisted. Every piece of counsel pushed Theoden deeper into weakness. The goal was never to kill the king. It was to hollow out the entire kingdom so that when Saruman's armies finally marched, Rohan would already be broken from the inside. But what makes Grima genuinely uncomfortable to think about is how small his desires were. He didn't want to conquer Middle-earth. He didn't want a ring of power. He wanted wealth, recognition, and Eowyn. That's it. Tolkien describes him as presumptuous and lecherous, a man corrupted not by grand ambition, but by petty, grasping want. He betrayed his king and his people for money and a woman who couldn't stand the sight of him. That smallness of motive is what makes him so unsettling, because it's relatable in a way that Sauron's world domination never will be. And his reward for all of it? After Gandalf exposed him, and he fled to Isengard, Grima ended up trapped in Orthanc as Saruman's glorified prisoner, years of abuse from the master he'd faithfully served. The spy became the captive. His final act, slitting Saruman's throat, wasn't some heroic awakening. It was rage, humiliation boiling over after years of degradation. Yet that murder accidentally served the greater good by ending Saruman's corruption of the Shire. Redemption by accident is still the lowest kind of redemption, but it's more than most traitors get. He ranks above Theoden on this list for one simple reason. Theoden was a victim. Grima made the choice. But if Grima's corruption came from wanting things he could never have, the next entry proves that having everything and still falling apart is somehow worse. Denethor. The films turned Denethor into a greasy, tomato-eating lunatic, and that's a shame because the real Denethor is so much worse. Not because he's crazier, but because he's smarter. Denethor II ruled as the steward of Gondor for 35 years, and for the vast majority of that time, he was genuinely formidable. Tolkien described him as a throwback to the darker side of Númenórean greatness, proud, calculating, culturally arrogant, and possessed of a will that few in Middle-earth could match. He wasn't evil. He was built like a fortress with very specific cracks in the foundation. Here's where it gets complicated. Denethor started using the Palantir of his own free will, trying to anticipate Sauron's movements so he could defend Minas Tirith. And honestly, that's a reasonable decision for a man who believed he was the last line of defense for Western civilization. He wasn't being reckless, he was doing his job. But the Palantir didn't just show him Sauron's armies. It showed him a world collapsing. And it did so while Denethor was already drowning. His wife Finduilas had died roughly 20 years before the War of the Ring, and that grief never left him. It calcified into something cold and brittle. The visions didn't create his despair, they accelerated it. And then Sauron started curating what Denethor saw. The critical deception was devastatingly simple. Sauron showed him a massive fleet approaching Gondor from the south and let Denethor conclude it was an enemy armada. It was actually Aragorn sailing to save the city. Denethor never knew. He saw the end coming and believed it completely because every rational inference he'd ever made pointed to exactly that conclusion. That's the horror. Denethor wasn't a fool who got tricked. He was the smartest man in the room, and Sauron used that intelligence like a weapon against him. Every skill Denethor had, his discipline, his analytical mind, his refusal to indulge in false hope, became the exact tools of his own destruction. So he built a funeral pyre for himself and his still living son Faramir. Not in a fit of madness. As a calculated final act by a man who had run every scenario and saw zero outcomes where hope survived. He chose fire over surrender, and he nearly took Gondor's last heir with him. Grima poisoned one king's court. Denethor's collapse nearly cost an entire civilization its future in the middle of the war that would decide everything. But if Denethor's corruption was despair weaponized by a stronger mind, the next entry is what happens when corruption doesn't just break someone, it rewrites them entirely. For almost 500 years. Gollum. Smeagol was a Stour hobbit who lived near the Gladden Fields, and Tolkien was very clear about something that changes how you should think about this character. He wasn't innocent before the ring found him. Tolkien described him as having a mean, thieving sort of nature already baked in. He was petty, sneaky, and barely tolerated by his own community. But here's where it gets dark. His cousin Diegol pulled the ring out of a river one afternoon, and Smeagol murdered him for it the same day. Not a week later. The same day. The ring needed almost zero time to push him from petty thief to killer, and that speed tells you everything about what was already lurking inside him. Now stretch that moment across 478 years. That's how long Gollum held the One Ring. Boromir lasted a few months near it before he snapped. Frodo carried it for roughly a year and was nearly destroyed. Gollum endured the ring's full corrosive weight for almost 5 centuries. No other bearer in the entire story, save Sauron himself, came anywhere close. Those centuries bent his body into something barely recognizable. They stretched his lifespan grotesquely beyond its natural limits. They fractured his mind so completely that 2 distinct personalities emerged, Smeagol and Gollum, each fighting the other for control in a war that never ended. But here's the part that makes his story stranger than anyone else's on this list. At the Cracks of Doom, after Frodo failed to destroy the ring voluntarily, Gollum seized it, he bit Frodo's finger off, held his precious above his head in absolute triumph, and fell into the fire. He achieved the goal that had defined his entire existence for nearly 5 centuries, and it killed him. And in killing him, it destroyed the ring. His corruption literally saved the world. That's the tragedy of Gollum. He wasn't a simple victim, but he also wasn't a simple monster. He was something in between. A creature so thoroughly unmade by corruption that his obsession accidentally accomplished what no hero could do on purpose. Grimma's accidental redemption was a knife in the dark. Gollum's was the hinge on which all of Middle-earth turned. But if you think half a millennium of corruption sounds extreme, wait until you hear about someone who's been enslaved for thousands of years and doesn't even remember being human. The Witch King of Angmar. We don't know his name. That's not a gap in the lore or something Tolkien forgot to write down. That is the point. The Witch King of Angmar was so thoroughly unmade by corruption that even his identity didn't survive. Gollum at least kept a name. 2 names, actually, because the ring fractured him into warring halves. The Witch King didn't get that luxury, there's nothing left to fracture. He was once a lord of Numenor, one of 3 Númenórean nobles who accepted rings of power directly from Sauron. The promise was simple: dominance and extended life. And the rings delivered. They delivered both of those things, and then they just kept going. But here's where it gets unsettling. This wasn't a quick fall. The corruption didn't happen over months or even years, it took centuries. The 9 rings exerted a slow, grinding influence on their bearers, gradually rendering them invisible, hollow, and completely enslaved to Sauron's will. By the time the process was finished, the 9 lords who had accepted those rings were no longer men in any meaningful sense. They existed trapped between life and death, between presence and absence, stripped of physical form and individual will alike. And the Witch King was the worst of them. As Lord of the Nazgul, he founded the kingdom of Angmar and ruled it for roughly 700 years, systematically conquering the successor states of Arnor one by one. That's not a single act of evil. That's geopolitical destruction on a civilizational scale, the kind of damage that outlasts any individual battle or betrayal. Entire nations cease to exist because of him. But the detail that really captures what he became: Weathertop. When the Witch King stabbed Frodo with a Morgul blade, that weapon would have turned Frodo into a lesser wraith, a servant bound to the same darkness. The corruption the Witch King carried wasn't just personal, it was literally contagious. He didn't just embody the loss of humanity, he could inflict it on others. And then there's the prophecy. Glorfindel foretold that the Witch King would not fall by the hand of man. When Éowyn killed him at Pelennor Fields, that prophecy was fulfilled, but think about what it implies. The category of man barely applied to the Witch King anymore. He had been so thoroughly drained of his humanity that even fate itself no longer classified him alongside the species he'd once belonged to. That's what separates him from Gollum on this list. Gollum's corruption split one identity into 2 warring pieces. Smeagol and Gollum fought each other for centuries, and that internal war, as painful as it was, meant something of the original person survived. The Witch King had no such conflict. There was no remnant personality fighting back, no flicker of the Númenórean Lord buried underneath. The ring didn't break him, it erased him. But if the Witch King represents what happens when corruption completely destroys a man, the next entry shows us what happens when it destroys something far more powerful. Saruman. Saruman the White was the chief of the Istari, the head of the White Council, the single most powerful being in Middle-earth, specifically tasked with opposing Sauron. Let that role sink in for a second, because what he became is the exact opposite of everything he was sent to do. The 5 wizards arrived in Middle-earth with one job: help the free peoples resist the Dark Lord. Saruman was their leader. He had the authority, the power, and the mandate. But here's where it gets interesting. The moment the Istari set foot in Middle-earth, the elven shipwright Círdan took one look at the group, ignored Saruman entirely, and handed Gandalf the elven ring of power called Narya. Círdan recognized Gandalf as the one who would matter most in the fight to come. Saruman, the supposed chief of the Order, was passed over on day 1. And that slight, it never left him. He nursed it for thousands of years. Tolkien himself identified impatience as the chief temptation of the Istari. The wizards were supposed to guide and inspire, not force outcomes. They were meant to trust in the free choices of others. Saruman couldn't do it. He wanted results, and he wanted them now, and he wanted to be the one delivering them. That impatience curdled into something worse. He began studying Sauron's methods, telling himself it was to understand the enemy. But you don't stare into the abyss for centuries without the abyss staring back. He went from studying Sauron to admiring him, from admiring him to imitating him, and from imitating him to believing he could wield Sauron's power better than Sauron ever could. He used a Palantir to communicate directly with the Dark Lord. He bred Uruk-hai by crossing orcs with men. He fully betrayed the White Council. The being sent by the gods themselves to stop Sauron became one of Saruman's most useful tools. But here's the part that really makes Saruman's corruption sting. It didn't lead to power, it led to irrelevance. His punishment wasn't some dramatic final battle, it was a slow, humiliating diminishment. From the chief wizard of Middle-earth, to a prisoner trapped in his own tower, to a petty tyrant ruining Hobbit gardens in the Shire. And his end, his own servant, Grima Wormtongue, the man he'd abused and degraded for years, slit his throat. That's it. No grand last stand. Just a broken manipulator killed by the one person he thought was too weak to ever turn on him. And this is why Saruman ranks above the Witch King. The Witch King was a mortal man who got tricked by a magic ring. Tragic, sure, but he was manipulated. Saruman was a divine being with full knowledge of what evil looked like, full authority to oppose it, and full awareness of what he was choosing when he chose otherwise. Nobody tricked him. Nobody enslaved him. He walked into darkness with his eyes wide open, convinced he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He wasn't. And if you think a fallen wizard is bad, wait until we talk about the thing he was trying to imitate. Sauron. His original name was Mairen. It meant the admirable. And he earned it. Before the world was even shaped, before the first sunrise or the first shadow, Mairen was the mightiest Maia in the service of Olli the Smith, a divine craftsman of unparalleled skill. He loved order. He loved precision. He loved making things work exactly as they should. And then Morgoth got to him. Here's where it gets complicated because nobody can pin down exactly when it happened. The evidence from Tolkien's writings suggests Sauron was corrupted either during the music of the Ainur, the cosmic song that shaped reality itself, or during the Spring of Arda, when the world was still being formed. Either way, his fall is among the oldest events in the entire history of creation. We're not talking about a guy who made a bad decision in his 20s. We're talking about a being who chose evil before most of existence even existed. But that was just the beginning. During the First Age, Sauron served as Morgoth's chief lieutenant, the one who executed what his master conceived but couldn't or wouldn't finish himself. He was the operational mind behind the chaos. And when Morgoth was finally defeated and banished into the timeless void, Sauron didn't crawl into a hole and disappear. He waited roughly 500 years, then returned to Middle-earth as the new Dark Lord. Not a successor, a replacement. But here's the part that reframes everything you already know about the Lord of the Rings. The Rings of Power weren't accidents, they were a trap. Sauron deceived the elven smiths into forging them, guided their craft, earned their trust. Then he went to Mount Doom alone and forged the One Ring in secret, pouring a portion of his own essence and will into the metal. His soul is literally inside that object, which means every time you watch Frodo struggling with the ring, every time Gollum whispered, "My precious," every time Boromir reached for it, they weren't just fighting temptation, they were fighting a fragment of a corrupted god. And destroying the ring didn't just destroy an object, it destroyed him. The Last Alliance cut the ring from his hand at the end of the Second Age, and he still survived in diminished form. He spent the entire Third Age slowly reconstituting himself, rebuilding his power, gathering his servants. You can't simply kill Sauron, because his corruption isn't just personal, it's structural. It's embedded in the architecture of the world through the rings, through his servants, through thousands of years of manipulation. That's what separates him from Saruman. Saruman was a corrupted divine being who fell alone. Sauron is a corrupted divine being who then corrupted the Nazgul, corrupted Saruman, corrupted entire civilizations across multiple ages. He scaled his fall into a force that reshaped the world. The elves who knew what he had become stopped calling him Mairon altogether. They called him Sauron. The Abhorred. One of the cleanest pieces of world-building Tolkien ever wrote. A single name change that tells you everything about how far this being fell. But even Sauron was a follower once, and the thing he followed was infinitely worse. Morgoth. Every single character we've talked about, every ringwraith, every fallen wizard, every broken king, they all trace back to one being. And he wasn't a wizard. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even a Maya like Sauron. He was a god. The most powerful of the Valar, the divine beings created before the world itself existed, his name was Melkor, meaning he who arises in might, and he is the reason this list exists at all. Here's the thing. Morgoth's corruption wasn't caused by a ring. Nobody whispered poison into his ear. No Palantir showed him visions of despair. His fall happened before the physical world was even made, during the music of the Ainur, the great song through which all of creation was designed. Melkor disrupted that music with his own themes because he wanted the song to be his. Not a contribution, not a harmony, his. That's it. Pure, primordial pride, and it fractured everything that came after. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Where Sauron poured his power into a single object, the One Ring, Morgoth did something far worse. He dispersed his very essence into Arda itself, into the rock, into the earth, into the biology of living creatures. The entire physical world became a vessel for his will. That's why evil in Middle-earth isn't just a political problem or a military threat, it's woven into matter. Every creature that turns cruel, every land that becomes blighted, every shadow that lingers a little too long, that's Morgoth. Still, even now. And the resume of destruction backs it up. He destroyed the 2 lamps that lit the world before the sun and moon existed. He destroyed the 2 trees of Valinor, the most beautiful things ever created. He stole the Silmarils. He enslaved entire civilizations across the First Age. He personally corrupted Sauron, who corrupted the Nine, who became the Nazgul, who terrorized Middle-earth for thousands of years. Every major evil the story explores is downstream of him. Pull any thread on this list and it leads back to Morgoth. It took literally everything to stop him. The War of Wrath, the final battle of the First Age, saw the combined armies of elves, men, and the Valar themselves break his forces, destroy his physical form, and thrust his spirit through the door of night into the timeless void outside of existence entirely. Not banished to another continent, not sealed in a tomb. Cast outside of time, space, and reality, with Arendelle guarding the door for eternity. And even that might not be permanent. Some traditions in Tolkien's writings suggest Morgoth will return for the Dagor Dagarath, the final battle at the end of all things. He sits at the top of this list not just because he fell the farthest, though he did, falling from the most powerful being in creation to a broken tyrant dragged out of his own fortress. He's here because his corruption seeded every other corruption we've covered. Sauron was Morgoth's student. The Rings of Power were Morgoth's legacy. The Witch King, Saruman, Denethor, Gollum, Boromir, all of them are consequences of a chain that started with one being deciding the Song of Creation should belong to him alone. Corruption in Middle-earth isn't random, it's a chain. And Morgoth is the first link. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.